Brenda Thornfield had been parking on my farm road for months, and somehow I was the criminal. This HOA president blocked my access route daily, claiming community easement rights that didn't exist. When I couldn't harvest because her BMW sat across my only equipment path, she called it my problem. When crops started rotting in the fields, she shrugged. When I finally snapped and demanded she move, she called the police.
He's harassing me on my property,
she lied to the officers. My property, my grandfather's road, my family's century-old farm. But her designer paperwork convinced them I was the troublemaker. That night, staring at thousands in ruined crops, I decided to build something massive that would launch her BMW so far she'd need GPS to find it. Tell me in the comments, what's the craziest thing you've ever wanted to do to get revenge on a terrible neighbor? Let me introduce myself properly. Edward Dunfield, third-generation farmer in Millbrook County, Georgia. My grandfather bought this 847-acre spread back in 1962, with dreams of growing the best heritage tomatoes this side of the Mississippi. The morning dew still glistens on those same fields, and the rich, earthy smell of Georgia soil after rain reminds me why 3 generations of Dunfields chose this life. My father expanded into specialty corn. Me? I was supposed to take over gradually, learn the ropes, maybe modernize a few things. Instead, I buried my wife Sarah last spring after a cancer fight that left me running this place solo. The farm became my sanctuary, where the distant hum of my John Deere 8400R, drowning out everything else, provided the only peace I could find. 3 years ago, some Atlanta developers bought the adjacent Thompson farm and carved it into Magnolia Estates, a gated subdivision where the houses cost more than most people make in a decade. Most new neighbors were decent folks who actually appreciated living next to a working heritage farm. But every paradise has its serpent. Brenda Thornfield moved into the biggest house 6 months after Sarah's funeral. Former real estate agent from Atlanta, divorced, no kids, and absolutely convinced that being elected HOA president made her queen of rural Georgia. She had this way of looking at my work clothes and sun-weathered hands like I was something that should be cleaned up for her community's aesthetic. The trouble started with my access road, a gravel strip my grandfather built in 1962 to reach our back 40 where the heritage tomatoes grow. What Brenda didn't know, and what I'd discover later, was that Grandpa had been smarter than any modern lawyer. That road carried federal agricultural protection designations from the drought emergency of 1962. Blocking it wasn't just trespassing, it was a federal crime. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Her first move was parking her BMW X5 at the road's edge, claiming she was monitoring community boundaries. When I asked her to move so my equipment could pass, she'd smile and say she'd just be a few more minutes. Those minutes became hours. The hours became her bringing a folding chair and romance novels. The morning I found her reading about shirtless cowboys while my harvest equipment sat blocked, I knew we had a real problem. "Ma'am, this is private property," I said, the rough hemp of my work gloves catching on the laminated property deed as I showed her Grandpa's documentation. Brenda looked up from her book and smiled, like she was explaining basic math to a toddler. "Mr. Dunfield, I've researched community easement laws. This road serves multiple properties now. You can't monopolize it for your industrial activities." Industrial activities. Like feeding people was some kind of inconvenience to her landscaping. "My family built this road, maintains this road, and pays taxes on this road," I explained. She glanced at Grandpa's deed like it was a CVS receipt. "Legal precedent changes, sweetie. My lawyer cousin Jerry says adverse possession protects community access. We're well within our rights." And there it was, Cousin Jerry. Small-town nepotism disguised as legal expertise. I should have seen that red flag from orbit. Within days, Brenda's parking strategy became military precision. She'd arrive exactly when I needed access, dawn for field prep, afternoon for equipment runs, evening for maintenance. Never long enough for trespassing charges, always long enough to cost me money. The folding chair became a pop-up canopy. The canopy became a storage shed. She installed security cameras aimed at my property for documentation purposes, and started timing my activities like she was conducting agricultural surveillance. Every conversation ended with her patting my arm condescendingly and lecturing me about community cooperation and changing times. The subtext was clear: know your place, farmer boy. Meanwhile, the sweet, sickly smell of rotting heritage tomatoes filled the September air as $20,000 in crops died in fields I couldn't reach. October brought Brenda's first real power move, and it involved more technology than NASA's mission control. I discovered her latest escalation on a crisp Monday morning, when the satisfying crunch of gravel under my work boots led me to something that made my blood pressure spike: a brand new security camera on a telescoping pole, aimed directly at my equipment barn. The morning air still carried that clean, metallic scent you get after a good frost, but all I could smell was trouble. The camera had a professional placard: Millbrook Agricultural Monitoring Station, HOA, Community Safety Initiative. Agricultural monitoring. On my property, without my permission. When I knocked on Brenda's door, she answered in a silk robe that cost more than my monthly diesel budget, gesturing toward multiple computer monitors displaying live feeds of my farm, like she was running agricultural surveillance for the Pentagon. "Mr. Dunfield, perfect timing. I was just reviewing yesterday's documentation patterns." "Documentation of what?" She pointed at the screens with the enthusiasm of a meteorologist tracking hurricanes. "Traffic analysis, equipment usage schedules, environmental impact assessments. My cousin Jerry suggested comprehensive documentation before filing our community easement application with the county." Community easement application. The words hit like a sledgehammer. That's when I realized Brenda wasn't just entitled. She was executing a long-term legal strategy to steal my grandfather's road, one illegally recorded video at a time. But I'd learned a thing or two about documentation myself during Sarah's medical battles with insurance companies. Two could play the paper trail game. That afternoon found me at Millbrook County Courthouse, where Dolores Martinez had been the institutional memory since dinosaurs roamed the earth. The building's musty smell of old records and bureaucratic victories welcomed me like an old friend. "Edward, honey," Dolores said, spreading out documents that would make Jerry's law degree about as useful as a chocolate teapot. "Your granddaddy was slicker than owl shit. Look here." She pointed to faded yellow highlighting on the 1962 survey: Federal Agricultural Emergency Access Route, Drought Relief Act compliance. During the big drought, Washington required certain properties to maintain critical food production access. Anyone blocking this road isn't just trespassing, they're committing federal agricultural interference. I remember Dad telling stories about Grandpa's obsession with reading every government regulation that crossed his desk. "Always said you never know when the fine print might save your bacon," Dad used to chuckle. Turns out Grandpa had been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. "What's that mean practically?" I asked. Dolores's grin could have lit up Atlanta. "Minimum 10,000 per incident, sugar. Your lady friend's been racking up federal violations faster than a Vegas slot machine." But here's where Brenda had made her first critical mistake. Her surveillance obsession worked both ways. I started my own documentation project, photographing every BMW blocking incident with timestamps that would make a forensic accountant weep with joy. But the real gift came when I installed my own cameras and discovered Brenda's operation violated more laws than a moonshine still. Her cameras were recording the county road, neighbors' properties, and half the wildlife in Georgia, all without permits. Meanwhile, Cousin Jerry had been filing legal documents using his Alabama license, which made his Georgia paperwork about as valid as monopoly money. Every motion, every filing, every threatening letter was potentially criminal fraud. The breakthrough came Thursday evening when Margaret Kowalski stopped by with casserole and neighborhood intelligence. The smell of her legendary chicken and dumplings, mixed with the lingering diesel fumes from my afternoon field work, created the kind of comfort combination that makes rural life worth defending. "That woman's documenting everything like she's building a federal case," Margaret said, settling into my kitchen chair with the confidence of someone who'd been fighting petty tyrants since before Brenda was born. She filmed my 8-year-old grandson riding his bike and sent me a formal complaint about unsupervised minor traffic violations. Margaret's grandson could barely reach the pedals. She's even photographing Dell's evening woodworking, claiming his scroll saw violates noise ordinances, Margaret continued. "If she thinks Dell's birdhouse project is loud, Lord help us all when she finds out what you're planning to build." That comment hung in the air like prophecy. When I called Deputy Ray Kowalski that night to discuss Brenda's illegal surveillance network, he couldn't take official action, civil matter, and jurisdictional complications. But he dropped an interesting hint. My dad might have insights on that federal agricultural stuff, Edward. Worked on rural infrastructure projects back in the day. Might want that conversation sooner than later. As Brenda's BMW pulled into its usual blocking position outside my window, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger this time, not frustration, pure, calculated anticipation. The game was changing, and I was finally ready to play. Brenda's next escalation proved she'd been planning this war longer than most people plan their retirements. 3 days after my courthouse discovery, a white pickup truck with Sentinel Security Services painted on the side rolled up like she was establishing a military checkpoint on my grandfather's road. Out stepped Wade Patterson, 6 feet of delusion wrapped in a polyester uniform that squeaked when he moved. His cologne hit me from 30 yards away, a chemical assault that could strip paint off a barn door. The morning dew was still glistening on my fence posts, but all I could smell was cheap aftershave and trouble. "Sir, I'm here to monitor property boundaries and ensure community safety," Wade announced, setting up a folding table like he was commanding a siege operation instead of watching an imaginary property dispute. "This is private property," I pointed out, gesturing at survey markers that had been here since Kennedy was president. Wade consulted his clipboard with the gravity of someone handling nuclear launch codes. "Ms. Thornfield has contracted professional security to document any aggressive behaviors toward community representatives. I'll be maintaining continuous surveillance." Continuous surveillance. Brenda had hired a wannabe cop to watch me grow vegetables, but Wade's presence handed me the perfect opportunity to test something I'd learned during my insurance battles with Sarah's medical bills. Always verify credentials before trusting anyone in uniform. Turns out, Sentinel Security Services existed primarily in Wade's imagination. 5 minutes on the Georgia Secretary of State website revealed the company had been dissolved 18 months ago for unpaid taxes. Wade was operating an unlicensed business, accepting payment for unauthorized services, and probably breaking enough laws to keep a prosecutor busy until Christmas. I'd also learned something interesting from my call to the Department of Agriculture. When federal agricultural access gets blocked by organized conspiracy involving fake businesses, the penalties jump from civil fines to criminal enterprise charges. Wade wasn't just helping Brenda steal my road, he was building a federal case against both of them. That evening, my neighbor Del Kowalski made his usual walk past my property, except this time he lingered by my workshop where the familiar sounds of evening farm maintenance created natural conversation cover. Del was one of those engineers who retired but never stopped calculating, the kind of man who built furniture strong enough to survive tornadoes. "Margaret mentioned your access situation," Del said, running calloused hands along my workbench like he was evaluating its structural integrity. The smell of sawdust and WD-40, mixed with the distant aroma of Margaret's pot roast drifting from their kitchen, reminded me of a physics project I did with my grandson last summer. "What kind of physics?" Del's eyes sparkled like he'd just solved a particularly elegant equation. "Trebuchet design, medieval counterweight system for launching projectiles. Built a scale model that could put a watermelon anywhere in my backyard with surgical precision." He showed me phone videos of his contraption hurling fruit across his property with engineering precision that would make NASA jealous. During my Army days, I'd studied ballistics enough to recognize serious accuracy when I saw it. "Fascinating engineering principles," Del continued thoughtfully. "Of course, you could scale something like that up considerably if you had the materials and workspace. Purely theoretical exercise, you understand." "How theoretical?" Del studied my workshop ceiling, mentally calculating load capacities with an engineer's instinctive precision. "Well, with proper timber construction and adequate counterweight mass, you could theoretically launch 4,000 pounds, approximately 150 feet with 3-foot accuracy. Historical farming demonstration purposes, naturally. 4,000 pounds. Roughly the curb weight of a BMW X5. Educational project about medieval agricultural defense," Del added, with the innocent expression of someone who'd spent 40 years building things that solved problems. "Bet the county would issue permits for historical demonstrations, community outreach and all." That night I found myself researching medieval siege engines, officially for Heritage Farming Education. YouTube turned out to be surprisingly comprehensive on trebuchet physics. Amazing what you can accomplish with leverage, counterweight, and proper trajectory calculations. Pure applied science. But Brenda wasn't finished with her legal assault. Friday morning brought her nuclear option, a formal harassment complaint filed with the Sheriff's Department, claiming my aggressive agricultural operations constituted intimidation of peaceful suburban residents. The complaint, filed by Cousin Jerry using credentials about as valid as Confederate currency, alleged my early morning farming violated noise ordinances, created safety hazards, and was deliberately designed to harass her community. When Deputy Ray Kowalski arrived to investigate, he looked like a man ordered to arrest his own grandfather. Ray had grown up on these roads, knew every farming family in the county. "Edward, I've got to ask these questions officially," Ray said, clearly hating every word. "But this situation makes about as much sense as putting socks on a rooster. She's claiming I'm harassing people by farming? According to this complaint, you're operating outside legal agricultural hours and creating deliberate public nuisances." Ray's tone suggested he'd rather be investigating actual crimes. As Ray finished his paperwork, I noticed Wade recording our entire conversation. Perfect. Some documentation cuts both ways. The afternoon sun caught Wade's camera lens like a targeting sight, and I realized Brenda's surveillance project had just created evidence of law enforcement investigating her victim. Chess, not checkers, just like Grandpa taught me. 2 weeks later, Brenda launched her legal nuclear strike, a $50,000 lawsuit that read like it was written by someone who'd learned law from watching courtroom dramas. The papers arrived on a crisp October morning, when the air still carried that metallic bite that makes Georgia autumns perfect for working outdoors. Instead of enjoying the weather, I found myself reading legal fiction that would have embarrassed a first-year law student. Cousin Jerry's masterpiece claimed I was conducting systematic agricultural intimidation and demanded compensation for Brenda's severe emotional trauma and residential property devaluation. Emotional trauma. From watching me harvest tomatoes. But Jerry had made a mistake that would have gotten him expelled from clown college, let alone law school. He'd filed in Fulton County, Atlanta jurisdiction, instead of Millbrook County, where the actual property existed. During Sarah's medical battles, I'd learned that jurisdiction matters in legal cases like foundation matters in construction. File in the wrong place, and your entire case collapses. The smell of fresh newsprint and industrial-strength coffee welcomed me into Patricia Wong's office at the Millbrook Gazette that afternoon. Patricia had been exposing local corruption since before the internet existed, and she studied Jerry's filing with the expression of a coroner examining suspicious remains. "Edward, this isn't just incompetent, it's borderline fraudulent," she said, cross-referencing Jerry's paperwork with her database of Georgia legal credentials. "Your adversary's cousin never applied for Georgia bar reciprocity. Every document he's filed here has the legal authority of a grocery list." But Patricia's investigation had uncovered something that made Jerry's credentials look stellar by comparison. His Alabama law firm had been sanctioned 3 times for frivolous litigation, and he was currently facing suspension for practicing while under investigation for client fund misappropriation. Brenda hadn't just hired incompetent representation. She'd partnered with someone who might be stealing client money. "Gets better," Patricia continued, pulling out a folder thick enough to stop bullets. "Jerry's been filing similar property grab lawsuits across 3 states. Same strategy. Claim adverse possession. File in wrong jurisdiction. Hope nobody notices the procedural violations." This wasn't Brenda's first rodeo. It was Jerry's traveling circus of legal fraud. Meanwhile, my defense network was expanding faster than kudzu in August. Margaret Kowalski's community awareness meetings had evolved into strategic war councils held in her living room over coffee that could wake the dead and homemade pie that could broker international peace treaties. The warm aroma of cinnamon and vanilla mixed with the determined energy of neighbors who'd finally had enough of Brenda's suburban imperialism. "That woman filed noise complaints against my morning rooster," announced Ethel Parker, whose family had been raising chickens since before Brenda was born. Claimed Clarence's crowing violated residential quiet hours. Clarence has been announcing sunrise on this road for 8 years. Jake Mills, whose hardware store had survived everything from economic recessions to hurricane seasons, nodded grimly. She's trying to eliminate anything that doesn't match her magazine vision of country living. Filed environmental complaints against the feed store for agricultural odors, and demanded the county investigate Doc Patterson's veterinary clinic for unsanitary animal smells. "Coarse horses smell like horses," Margaret observed dryly. "Next she'll complain that dirt looks too much like dirt." But the real breakthrough came when Dell introduced me to Claude Brewster, a retired civil engineer whose 40-year career had been built on solving impossible infrastructure problems. Claude possessed the kind of methodical brilliance that could calculate structural loads while eating breakfast and design bridges in his spare time. "Your grandfather was operating at PhD level while everyone else was still learning multiplication," Claude said, reviewing the 1962 federal documentation in my workshop, where the comfortable smell of WD-40 and sawdust created the perfect atmosphere for engineering revelations. During my Army engineering training, I'd learned that federal infrastructure protection carried serious legal weight. But Claude explained that Grandpa's designation went beyond simple road access. It protected the entire agricultural operation as critical food security infrastructure. "Every hour of interference compounds the federal violations," Claude continued, with the satisfaction of someone who'd found the perfect solution to an impossible equation. At current daily fine calculations, she owes more in federal penalties than her subdivision is worth. Claude pulled out his phone and showed me penalty calculation spreadsheets that would make an accountant weep with joy. But here's the beautiful part. Federal agricultural interference becomes criminal conspiracy when it involves multiple participants and fraudulent legal representation. That evening, as Wade positioned his camera to document my routine evening equipment maintenance, I felt the deep satisfaction of watching an enemy's strategy collapse under the weight of their own stupidity. Brenda wanted to play federal documentation games with someone whose grandfather had been reading government regulations since Eisenhower was president. Perfect. Class was about to begin. The discovery that changed everything came from the dusty chaos of my grandfather's forgotten treasures. I was cleaning the workshop storage room that Saturday, hunting for irrigation parts, when I accidentally kicked over Grandpa's ancient tackle box. The rusted latches popped open, spilling yellowed papers across the oil-stained concrete, like secrets demanding to be heard. The musty smell of old documents mixed with the lingering scent of motor oil and decades-old fishing bait created an atmosphere thick with family history. One envelope stopped my heart cold. The return address read, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Emergency Operations Division, October 1962. Inside was a letter that would have made Jerry's fraudulent lawsuit look like a grocery store coupon. The correspondence, signed by some long-dead federal coordinator, thanked Grandpa for enrolling in the Strategic Food Security Infrastructure Program. During the Cuban Missile Crisis and subsequent drought emergency, certain rural properties had been classified as critical national food production sites, with federal protection that superseded every local law, state regulation, and HOA fantasy ever written. My road wasn't just agricultural access. It was federally designated emergency food supply infrastructure with the same legal protection as military installations. But the second page delivered the knockout punch. Any interference with federal agricultural access constituted crimes under the National Defense Authorization Act, carrying mandatory $50,000 minimums per violation and potential prison sentences that would make armed robbery look like a parking citation. Brenda hadn't been committing trespassing. She'd been racking up federal felonies that carried more jail time than most drug dealers received. I called Claude immediately, and when he arrived an hour later with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral, his engineer's precision gave way to pure amazement. "Edward, your grandfather wasn't just planning for bad weather. He was playing four-dimensional chess while everyone else was learning checkers," Claude said, handling the documents like archaeological artifacts. The afternoon light streaming through my workshop windows illuminated text that would rewrite Brenda's entire legal strategy. During Sarah's insurance battles, I'd learned that federal law always trumps local regulations like rock beats scissors. But this designation was permanent, irrevocable federal protection that made Brenda's property claims about as valid as claiming ownership of the White House. "Every day she's blocked your road. Every hour Wade's maintained his security theater. Every fraudulent document Jerry's filed. All federal crimes, compounding exponentially," Claude continued with the satisfaction of someone who'd just calculated the perfect structural solution. Why didn't you tell me to file charges immediately? Claude's grin could have powered the county. Because federal law requires documentation, an opportunity for violators to cease criminal activity before prosecution. You can choose the timing of their legal apocalypse. The strategic implications hit like revelation. File now, and Brenda faced immediate federal prosecution. Wait until she'd completely destroyed herself, and the penalties would multiply like compound interest on stupidity. That night, I made a decision Grandpa would have appreciated. The federal case would remain my nuclear option, deployed for maximum effect when Brenda had thoroughly incriminated herself. Meanwhile, Dell's theoretical trebuchet discussions had evolved into practical construction planning. His evening workshop visits now involved actual blueprints for what we diplomatically called medieval agricultural heritage demonstrations. Counterweight siege engines represent fascinating physics principles, Dell explained, sketching calculations that would put a 4,000-pound payload anywhere within a football field radius. Educational community outreach with historical significance. The beauty was perfect legality. Historical demonstrations required county permits, which we'd obtain. Agricultural heritage projects enjoyed community support, which we had. And medieval engineering attracted media attention, which would provide ideal timing for federal revelations. Brenda wanted to play federal documentation games while building her case through criminal conspiracy. Perfect. Monday morning, we'd begin teaching her why farmers always win long-term strategic planning contests. Federal paperwork could wait, but timber construction would start at dawn. Monday morning brought the kind of crisp November air that makes honest work feel like salvation. And Dell arrived at my workshop carrying blueprints that looked official enough to build a federal courthouse. The rich smell of Margaret's coffee, mixed with the sweet scent of sawdust, as we spread his engineering masterpiece across my workbench, like generals planning the siege of Atlanta. Historical agricultural defense reconstruction, Dell announced, with the reverence of someone unveiling the Mona Lisa. Completely legitimate educational demonstration of medieval farming protection techniques. The design was poetry, written in timber and physics. A 40-foot throwing arm built from reclaimed barn beams that had weathered a century of Georgia storms, anchored to a frame engineered to withstand forces that would reduce modern construction to kindling. The counterweight system used 3,000 pounds of concrete blocks, salvaged from the old Thompson Foundation. Enough potential energy to launch a compact SUV clear into the next zip code. During my Army engineering training, I'd learned that medieval siege engines were marvels of applied mathematics disguised as weapons of war. Dell's calculations proved our ancestors understood physics principles that would make modern engineers humble. Trajectory mathematics precise enough to hit a beer can from 2 football fields, Dell explained, pointing to equations that NASA would have approved. Course, we're aiming for educational impact, not precision targeting. Educational impact. Right. Claude Brewster arrived with surveying equipment and 40 years of experience building things that never fell down. Together, we selected the perfect location. Level ground with clear sight lines to the natural mud pit that marked my property's back boundary. Exactly 147 feet from where Brenda preferred parking her BMW, like she was claiming territory in a land rush. Pure ballistic science, Claude said, while setting survey stakes with the precision of someone who'd never built anything that collapsed. Counterweight mass times gravitational acceleration, divided by projectile weight, factored for lever arm ratios and atmospheric resistance. The math was beautiful. A 4,000-pound payload would follow a perfect parabolic arc from launch point to landing zone, achieving maximum altitude of 60 feet before gravity demonstrated why medieval farmers never worried about parking violations. Meanwhile, community support was snowballing faster than our construction progress. Margaret organized Heritage Farm Days, a weekend festival celebrating traditional agricultural techniques that happened to coincide with our educational demonstration. The planning committee included every family name that mattered in 3 counties, plus media connections that would make political campaigns jealous. Tourism opportunity with historical significance, Margaret explained, while coordinating volunteers with the efficiency of someone who'd organized church fundraisers since the Eisenhower administration. The warm aroma of her strategic planning cookies filled my kitchen as neighbors signed up for everything from construction assistance to media relations. Jake Mills contributed materials with the enthusiasm of someone finally getting payback against unreasonable customers. Always figured physics could solve more problems than diplomacy, he said, delivering hardware that could anchor a nuclear submarine. Educational purposes, naturally. The county building permit sailed through approval like greased lightning. Our historical agricultural exhibit met every safety code, carried proper insurance through the Heritage Society, and had professional engineering supervision. The inspector even suggested we contact schools about educational field trips. Outstanding community project, he noted, studying Dell's structural drawings with genuine admiration. Children could learn physics, history, and practical mathematics simultaneously. Rare to see authentic historical reconstruction with modern safety standards. By Wednesday, word had spread through social media faster than kudzu in August. The South's largest historically accurate trebuchet was being built in Millbrook County for educational demonstrations. Tourism inquiries flooded in from 3 states. Local hotels reported weekend booking surges, and the Georgia Department of Education inquired about curriculum development opportunities. Thursday brought academic validation. Medieval studies professors drove from universities to document our construction process. The State Agricultural Extension Office sent representatives to discuss historical farming preservation. Even the County Historical Society offered matching funds for permanent educational displays. Tremendous scholarly significance, announced Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, whose medieval studies credentials could fill a library. Authentic reconstruction of agricultural defense systems used across Europe for centuries. This represents serious contribution to historical preservation. Meanwhile, Brenda's surveillance operation documented our progress with the dedication of someone building a federal case. Wade's cameras recorded every timber placement, every bolt tightening, every calculation discussion. Perfect. Some evidence serves unexpected purposes. Friday evening, as sunset painted our completed trebuchet golden against the Georgia sky, I felt the deep satisfaction of preparation meeting destiny. The massive throwing arm stretched 40 feet skyward, like a monument to engineering excellence, while the counterweight system weighted with 3 tons of potential energy, ready to demonstrate physics principles, unchanged since Newton discovered gravity. Saturday's Heritage Farm Days would begin at 9 a.m., with historical lectures and traditional farming demonstrations. The trebuchet educational presentation was scheduled for 11 a.m., with media coverage and agricultural officials attending for maximum community impact. All the pieces were positioned perfectly. Physics demonstrations work best with proper audience and adequate documentation. We just needed the right educational opportunity. Thursday morning brought Brenda's media blitz, and watching her destroy herself on live television was better than Saturday night entertainment. Channel 7 News arrived like Brenda had summoned the National Guard, complete with a perfectly coiffed reporter whose knowledge of agriculture probably peaked at grocery store produce sections. The sweet smell of November honeysuckle mixed with the diesel exhaust from the news van as they positioned cameras to capture Brenda's exclusive exposé about farmer terrorism threatening suburban peace. I'm Rebecca Martinez, standing with Brenda Thornfield, whose neighbor's aggressive farming has allegedly crossed from agriculture into intimidation, the reporter announced with the gravity of someone covering international warfare. Brenda launched into 15 minutes of performance art describing my threatening behavior, starting tractors at dawn, legal farming hours, harvesting crops during harvest season, shocking agricultural activity, and constructing medieval siege weapons designed to terrorize peaceful families. She gestured at my property like I was operating a terrorist training camp instead of growing heritage tomatoes. The interview was Academy Award worthy until Rebecca asked actual journalist questions. Miss Thornfield, why is your car parked on Mr. Dunfield's private access road right now? Brenda's pause lasted longer than a Democratic filibuster. Behind her, clearly visible to 200,000 viewers, sat her BMW blocking my equipment route, while Wade's security circus looked like a military occupation of someone else's property. We're conducting usage pattern documentation for our legal case, Brenda stammered, her media confidence deflating faster than a punctured balloon. Community safety requires monitoring of industrial farming operations. Industrial operations? You mean growing food? Aggressive, large-scale agricultural intimidation designed to harass residential neighbors, Brenda corrected, apparently describing farming like it was chemical warfare against subdivisions. Rebecca's journalism instincts, sharper than Brenda anticipated, went for the throat. "Do you have legal permission to park on his private property?" That's when Brenda's media strategy collapsed like Jerry's legal credentials. "This road serves community needs now. Adverse possession establishes usage rights through sufficient occupancy." During Sarah's insurance battles, I'd learned that reporters love catching people in obvious lies on camera. Rebecca's follow-up was surgical. "Has any court ruled on these alleged usage rights?" Brenda's expression suggested she'd expected softball questions about suburban victimhood, not actual legal scrutiny. "Our attorney has filed comprehensive documentation with appropriate judicial authorities." "Which attorney? What court? What's the case number?" The deer-in-headlights silence that followed became the clip that went viral on local Facebook groups within hours. The evening broadcast included legal commentary that dissected Brenda's claims like a biology class examining roadkill. 3 minutes of constitutional law education explained why adverse possession requires 20 years of exclusive use, why blocking agricultural access violates federal law, and why Cousin Jerry's Alabama credentials made his Georgia filings about as legitimate as Confederate currency. But Brenda's media humiliation was just Thursday's appetizer. Friday delivered Jerry's legal masterpiece, an emergency injunction claiming my trebuchet constituted imminent domestic terrorism requiring immediate federal intervention. The motion, filed in his traditional wrong jurisdiction, demanded U.S. Marshals shut down my illegal weapons manufacturing operation threatening suburban safety. Weapons manufacturing. We were building a county-permitted historical education exhibit with professional engineering supervision. Jerry's brief included Wade's construction photographs, presented as evidence of siege warfare preparation and residential intimidation infrastructure. The document read like someone had learned constitutional law from action movies, citing federal statutes that existed only in Jerry's imagination and court precedents he'd apparently invented during hallucinogenic episodes. Judge Patricia Martinez's rejection included language that would make constitutional scholars frame it for office walls. Her written response featured phrases like frivolous beyond comprehension, legally incoherent, and drafted by someone apparently unfamiliar with jurisprudence, geography, or reality. She also forwarded Jerry's fraudulent practice documentation to the State Bar Association for immediate criminal investigation. But Saturday's main event made Jerry's legal incompetence look subtle by comparison. Federal agricultural investigators arrived at Brenda's door like tax auditors with subpoena power, carrying documentation that made her media interview look like a confession video. I watched from my workshop window, the crisp morning air carrying voices clearly across the property line, as two agents in suits that screamed serious federal consequences spent an hour explaining why blocking designated federal agricultural infrastructure carried penalties that would bankrupt her subdivision. The rich aroma of Margaret's Heritage Farm Days preparation cookies drifted from her kitchen as Brenda's increasingly hysterical protests about community rights mixed with the agent's patient recitation of federal agricultural protection laws like a very expensive legal education seminar. Wade, meanwhile, had committed his own federal violation by recording government agents conducting official business, adding wiretapping charges to his impressive collection of criminal stupidity. As Heritage Farm Days volunteers began arriving for final preparations, I noticed something beautiful about cosmic timing. Brenda's BMW sat perfectly positioned in my trebuchet's calculated trajectory zone, like the universe itself was providing educational demonstration opportunities. Physics was about to meet justice in the most satisfying way possible. Saturday evening brought Brenda's final desperate gambit, and it was spectacular in its complete disconnection from reality. While Heritage Farm Days volunteers finished setting up educational displays and media crews tested equipment for Sunday's demonstration, Brenda organized what she called an emergency community safety summit at the HOA clubhouse. The smell of fresh-baked cornbread from the Heritage Festival food trucks mixed with the acrid scent of panic as Brenda's remaining supporters gathered for what looked more like a crisis intervention than a community meeting. Her audience consisted of exactly 7 people. Wade, who should have been fleeing to Mexico, cousin Jerry, who should have been hiding from Bar Association investigators, 3 elderly HOA residents who'd apparently missed the memo about Brenda's federal criminal status, and 2 people who'd wandered in thinking it was a book club meeting. "Fellow residents," Brenda announced, with the authority of someone declaring war on physics itself. "We face an unprecedented terrorist threat to our community's safety and property values." Terrorist threat. She was talking about a county-permitted educational demonstration with professional engineering oversight. But Brenda's speech revealed the full scope of her delusion. She'd convinced herself that my trebuchet was designed specifically to destroy her house, that federal agricultural investigators were paid actors in my intimidation campaign, and that tomorrow's Heritage Festival was actually a cover operation for suburban invasion by aggressive farming interests. "This medieval weapon points directly at our homes," she continued, gesturing toward my property, where the trebuchet's 40-foot arm was clearly visible against the evening sky. Tomorrow's so-called demonstration is actually a practice run for property destruction, designed to force us from our legally purchased homes. The 3 confused elderly residents exchanged glances that suggested they were questioning Brenda's mental stability. One of them, Mrs. Henderson from Magnolia Lane, raised a trembling hand. "Dear, isn't that just an educational project? My grandson's excited about the physics demonstration." Brenda's response revealed how far she'd traveled into conspiracy territory. "Mrs. Henderson, they've clearly brainwashed your family with agricultural propaganda. This is psychological warfare, designed to make us accept the destruction of suburban civilization by industrial farming operations." Jerry, meanwhile, had been frantically taking notes for what he announced would be a comprehensive federal lawsuit demanding military intervention to protect residential communities from agricultural terrorism. Apparently, having his legal credentials investigated for fraud hadn't dampened his enthusiasm for filing increasingly insane motions. But the evening's real entertainment came when Deputy Ray Kowalski arrived to serve Brenda with a restraining order, filed by the federal agricultural investigators, prohibiting her from interfering with protected federal infrastructure, pending criminal prosecution. "Ma'am, you're legally required to cease all access roadblocking immediately," Ray explained, with the patience of someone who'd rather be investigating actual crimes. "Federal agricultural interference charges carry mandatory minimum sentences that don't require local law enforcement discretion." Brenda's reaction was pure theater. "This is clearly coordinated harassment by corrupt government officials protecting terrorist farming operations. I demand you arrest the real criminals destroying our community's safety." Ray's expression suggested he was calculating early retirement options. "Ma'am, federal agricultural protection laws have existed since 1962. Blocking designated emergency food production access is a federal crime, regardless of local opinions." That's when Wade made his final contribution to their criminal enterprise. He stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd watched too many police procedural shows and announced he was placing Ray under citizen's arrest for conspiracy to commit agricultural terrorism. Wade actually attempted to handcuff a sheriff's deputy. The sound of Ray's backup units arriving 10 minutes later, sirens cutting through the evening air like musical accompaniment to Wade's arrest, provided perfect background noise for Brenda's complete psychological meltdown. She spent 20 minutes screaming about federal conspiracies, agricultural terrorism, and suburban genocide, while Ray patiently explained that interfering with law enforcement added additional felony charges to her impressive collection. Meanwhile, Heritage Farm Day's preparation continued around Brenda's crisis like life flowing around a roadside accident. The warm glow of setup lights created a festival atmosphere that contrasted beautifully with the flashing red and blue of police cars dealing with Brenda's legal apocalypse. By midnight, Wade was in county lockup, facing federal charges that would keep legal scholars busy for years. Jerry had fled to Alabama to hide from Bar Association investigators, and Brenda sat alone in her mansion, probably calculating whether bankruptcy or imprisonment offered better long-term prospects. But her BMW remained in its perfect blocking position, like a monument to stubborn stupidity positioned exactly 147 feet from my trebuchet's launch point. Sunday morning's Heritage demonstration was scheduled to begin at 9 a.m., with the educational trebuchet presentation at 11.
Media crews from 3 states had confirmed coverage.
Federal agricultural officials would be documenting historical farming techniques, and approximately 500 visitors were expected to witness medieval engineering applied to modern agricultural education. The morning air carried the distant sound of Brenda's house alarm system. Apparently, she'd activated every security feature she owned, like electronic fortifications could protect her from the consequences of 6 months of federal crimes. Perfect timing for a physics lesson about the inevitability of gravity. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of crisp November clarity that makes Georgia autumns legendary, and Heritage Farm Days opened with more fanfare than a presidential campaign rally. By 9 a.m., visitors were streaming onto my property like I was hosting the state fair.
The rich aroma of kettle corn mixed with the sweet scent of apple cider, as families explored educational displays about traditional farming techniques, while children ran between demonstrations of heritage seed preservation and antique equipment restoration. The morning dew still glistened on my fence posts, but the excitement in the air was thick enough to cut with a corn knife. Media crews from Atlanta, Augusta, and Savannah had positioned cameras for optimal coverage of what Channel 7 was promoting as the South's largest historically accurate trebuchet demonstration. Dr. Hartwell from the university had arrived with graduate students carrying enough measurement equipment to launch NASA missions, while federal agricultural officials mingled with the crowd like they were attending an academic conference, instead of witnessing potential vehicular physics. At 10:30, I noticed Brenda's BMW still occupying its traditional blocking position across my access road, perfectly aligned in the trebuchet's calculated trajectory path, like destiny had arranged the educational opportunity herself. 11 a.m. brought showtime. Standing before a crowd of 500 visitors, 3 television crews, federal officials, and enough social media cameras to document the apocalypse, I felt the weight of 6 months of escalating conflict condensed into a single moment of physical demonstration. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the crisp morning air. "Today's historical demonstration showcases medieval siege engine technology that protected agricultural communities for centuries. Our trebuchet represents authentic reconstruction of defensive equipment used by farmers to resolve persistent problems." The crowd's anticipatory murmur suggested they understood the educational subtext. Behind the gathered audience, I spotted federal agents taking notes, while Brenda watched from her upstairs window, like she was witnessing her own execution. Wade was conspicuously absent, probably contemplating federal prison accommodations, while Cousin Jerry had apparently fled to Alabama faster than Sherman's army in reverse. "Medieval trebuchets achieved remarkable accuracy through applied physics," I continued, gesturing toward Dell's engineering masterpiece. "Proper counterweight ratios, optimal lever mechanics, and precise trajectory calculations could place a 4,000-pound projectile within 3 feet of any designated target." Dr. Hartwell's graduate students began recording measurements with scientific precision, while television crews captured every angle of the 40-foot throwing arm that stretched skyward like a monument to engineering excellence. "Today's demonstration will launch abandoned property that has been blocking federal agricultural access in violation of emergency food production regulations," I announced, my voice carrying the satisfaction of perfect legal coverage. "Federal law requires removal of obstacles interfering with designated critical infrastructure." Sheriff Ray Kowalski stepped forward with documentation that made everything official. "Vehicle abandoned on private agricultural property for over 18 hours constitutes legal abandonment under Georgia Statute 4011-2. Property owner authorized to remove obstacles by any reasonable means." Reasonable means. I love legal language. The crowd's excitement built as Dell's engineering team made final calibration adjustments. The massive counterweight system, 3 tons of concrete blocks, hung ready to demonstrate gravitational physics with the precision of a Swiss watch. Margaret's Heritage Society volunteers positioned safety barriers, while Patricia Wong's cameras captured every angle for what would become the most watched agricultural education video in Georgia history. "Physics demonstration commencing," I called out, approaching the trebuchet's release mechanism, while television audiences across 3 states watched live coverage of medieval engineering meeting modern justice. The counterweight dropped with a thunderous crash that shook the ground like minor earthquakes.
The 40-foot throwing arm whipped upward in a perfect arc, launching Brenda's BMW X5 into the Georgia sky with the grace of a steel ballet. 4,000 pounds of German automotive engineering sailed through crisp November air in a parabolic trajectory that would make physics professors weep with admiration. The vehicle achieved maximum altitude of 63 feet before gravity claimed it, delivering the BMW to the exact center of my property's natural mud pit with an earth-shaking impact that sent water geysering 20 feet skyward. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause that could probably be heard in downtown Atlanta. Television crews captured slow-motion footage of automotive flight, while Dr. Hartwell's team recorded trajectory data that would revolutionize medieval engineering studies. Social media exploded with video clips that reached viral status before the BMW finished settling into the swamp. But the real satisfaction came from Brenda's reaction. I watched her emerge from her house, still in pajamas, staring at her mud-covered BMW like someone had just explained quantum physics using interpretive dance. She stood speechless while federal agents approached with documentation, explaining that federal agricultural interference fines now exceeded her property value by approximately 300%. That's what happens when you park stupid games with federal agricultural law, I told the Channel 7 cameras, grinning like someone who just won the physics lottery. BMW removal cost, $0. Federal fines for blocking emergency food access, $847,000 and counting. Watching medieval engineering solve modern problems, absolutely priceless. The mic drop moment was perfect. 6 months later, Heritage Farm Educational Center had become the most popular agritourism destination in 3 counties, and our trebuchet was booked solid for physics demonstrations through the following Christmas. The immediate aftermath of BMW launch day had been sweeter than Margaret's prize-winning peach cobbler. Federal agricultural investigators served Brenda with criminal charges, carrying mandatory minimum sentences that would keep her busy until her grandchildren reached voting age. The $847,000 in accumulated fines for federal agricultural interference had forced her into bankruptcy, and her house was already under foreclosure proceedings that moved faster than her BMW had flown through Georgia airspace. Cousin Jerry faced disbarment in Alabama and criminal fraud charges in Georgia for practicing law without proper credentials. His legal career was about as salvageable as Brenda's mud-covered BMW, which required specialized equipment costing more than the vehicle's actual worth to extract from my swamp. Wade was serving federal time for wiretapping government agents, interfering with law enforcement, and operating unlicensed security services, a trifecta of stupidity that legal scholars would study for decades. But the real victory was what we'd built from their attempted destruction. The Heritage Farm Educational Center now hosted monthly physics and farming festivals that drew families from across the Southeast. Children learned about lever mechanics while launching pumpkins, studied trajectory mathematics while watching watermelon demonstrations, and discovered that agricultural science could be more exciting than video games. The warm smell of funnel cakes, mixed with the educational excitement of kids experiencing live physics, made every festival feel like academic Christmas morning. Dell's trebuchet design had become the engineering standard for educational siege engines. Universities requested blueprints for physics departments. Medieval studies programs incorporated our construction process into their curricula, and the Smithsonian had inquired about permanent exhibition possibilities. Our YouTube channel, Trebuchet Physics, generated enough advertising revenue to fund scholarship programs for agricultural engineering students who understood that farming required more science than most people realized. The community transformation was even more satisfying than the physics demonstrations. Magnolia Estates had dissolved their HOA after Brenda's legal disasters, and residents formed a volunteer neighborhood association that actually cooperated with local farming operations instead of declaring war on rural life. Property values increased through heritage tourism. Young families moved to the area specifically for agricultural education opportunities, and the local school district added agricultural science curriculum inspired by our programs. Margaret's community awareness meetings had evolved into the Millbrook Agricultural Heritage Society, which now managed historical preservation projects across the county.
Jake Mills reported record sales of engineering supplies as families built backyard catapults for educational purposes. Even Dr. Hartwell's Medieval Studies Department had established a satellite campus focusing on agricultural history and practical physics education. The scholarship fund we'd established in Sarah's memory had already supported 12 students pursuing degrees in agricultural engineering, sustainable farming, and rural education. Every semester brought new applications from kids who'd attended our demonstrations and discovered that science could solve problems while feeding communities. Sarah would have loved knowing that her memory was helping young people combine education with practical purpose. The Federal Agricultural Protection Designation had become a model for other heritage farms facing suburban encroachment. Property rights organizations used our case as precedent for protecting working agricultural land from HOA overreach, and similar federal protections were being established across rural America. Sometimes one family's fight becomes everyone's victory. As for Brenda's ultimate fate, she'd moved to a retirement community in Florida, where HOA regulations were strictly limited to landscaping choices and mailbox colors. Rumor had it she'd become a model resident who never complained about anything louder than lawnmowers. Apparently, federal criminal charges provide excellent attitude adjustment therapy. These days, I wake up to the sound of school buses arriving for educational field trips instead of BMW engines blocking my access road. The sweet smell of heritage tomatoes ripening in fields I can actually reach has replaced the sour scent of legal troubles and property disputes. Every morning brings families excited to learn about agricultural science, medieval engineering, and the physics principles that make both possible. Next month, we're expanding into historical bridge construction techniques that Dell claims could solve certain county road maintenance issues. Apparently, some city council members think farmers don't pay sufficient taxes, and Dell has fascinating ideas about medieval infrastructure solutions for modern bureaucratic problems.